So I'm just going to go through my experience and how I actually teach directors prep online in a workshop. My method is called Directors Prep for Success, and I've been directing for about 14 years now. These are examples of the two verticals that I've done: Dead Girls Detective Agency, and one for these new, what they call romance dramas, vertical romance dramas that are all the rage here. So some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, and like Jen said, feel free to ask questions, but I'm just going to go through some of the things that you consider when you're doing vertical, some of the tools I use. And like I said, prep-wise, it's pretty much the same process that I use for any narrative or any directing job. There's just a couple of little tweaks and little differences specifically for vertical filmmaking. So these are the things that we're just going to go through. So things to consider. Obviously, you're shooting vertically. Duh. So your framing has to be a little different, and I'll get to that in the next one. But firstly, like I said, a lot of these live on these digital platforms, and that affects your scheduling because it affects the way you shoot and it affects the rate of change. A lot of them are very, very fast moving, and they want a really fast rate of change. So a lot of shots, a lot of back and forth between the characters. So your shot listing tends to explode because you need to cover that. And dialogue seems to go a lot faster. And episodic stuff, episodes tend to be a lot, shorter than usual. So you really have to pack a lot of story into a very short amount of time. And I'm just generalizing here. Obviously, there are bigger budget vertical shows and whatnot, but just kind of experiences that I've had, I've had to really rethink how I shot list. When I did Dead Girls, for example, I had to double my shot list that I usually do, instead of a wide, a medium, a single. It was and then you got to think about a split screen. And then you got to think about moving, 5 times faster than you usually do. So that really affects the way you schedule because, you're scheduling twice as many shots really in a day that you would. And you really have to work very closely with your AD on that and your DP and coverage. Obviously, that's all ties into the same thing. A lot of the clients are always asking for much more coverage when you're shooting vertical. And I've done with the camera specifically, I've shot both ways. I've shot horizontally with a mat that you see on the left here, which is how we did Dead Girls. And you just have guidelines of where your actual usable frame is. The pluses of doing this was, as you see here, there's a single, but we could get 2 singles at the same time. If you had 2 characters standing next to each other facing the same way, we would have 2 mats split. And so on one camera, we got 2 singles instead of 1, and the other camera would get, 2. If there were 4 people in a scene, you could get 4 singles basically all at one time. Obviously, disadvantages are movement, trying to catch people in frame. It gets a little more complicated and harder, and you kind of don't really get your final frame in that form. So in my last show that you see on the right here, we shot actually vertically, as you can see on his monitor there. So for the DPs, that tends to be a little easier because they can get their final frame, they can move and find people a little easier. Just really quickly, obviously, your director's monitor is going to be set up vertically as well. The question that people tend to ask me a lot is, do you shoot them on the phone? And no, we don't. We shoot them on, digital or cinema cameras. Other things to consider: movement. So most of what you're considering for vertical are these things. You're framing a little differently. You're moving a little differently because you're in a little bit more of a limited frame. What I mean by that is horizontal panning. I tend to steer away from that kind of movement too much because it gets a little dizzying to watch, and it's also a little harder to frame people. So finding a 2-shot, for example, and you're panning, it's a little harder to land on that because you don't have a lot of forgiveness on either side of the frame. So that kind of movement gets a little limited, or fishing for shots. It gets a little harder for your operators to do that. So you have to think a little bit outside of the box. So do you kind of tilt down instead of doing a pan? Do you figure out your kind of world vertically rather than you have to kind of flip your thinking a little bit? And the framing, you can't go too wide. I don't have an example here because I don't shoot very wide, but imagine if you're, you used to these established wide shots, but then you have all this empty space on top and the bottom of the frame, and it tends to not look so good. So you are a little bit limited in how you frame. And then unless you want a lot of negative space. Obviously, each project is a little different, but you tend to kind of get a limited number of characters on screen because of this. See on the right here was a split screen from Dead Girls, but we could get 3 characters in there because it was going to be a split. But imagine if this was vertical, you'd either have a ton of heads room or, you kind of have this weird framing. So you have to think about your blocking and your framing a little differently when you have more than, 2 characters in a space. The other thing is like 2 shots. Actors don't quite get it until they do it, how close they have to be, like how very, very close your 2 characters have to be. They almost have to be touching in every shot if there's 2 of them, especially if there's like a, profile 2 shot. They're like almost kissing as they're talking and it gets a little uncomfortable. So you do have to ease them into it. So that's an interesting thing that you have to think about. Oddly enough, crowd scenes sometimes are a little better because you can pack more people into a frame and it makes it look crowded a lot easier. So these are just kind of some of the things that you consider going in. Like I said, mostly a lot of it is just thinking about framing and movement and blocking are the big things. In terms of prepping for them, like I said, it's I do the same process as I usually do and the way that I teach. Here are some of the tools that I usually use. Scriptation, if you're not already using it, it's the best. And it also helps with a fast-paced production, which a lot of these are. The last vertical I did, we shot, I think, on 15-page days, sometimes 10 and above, basically, you're shooting for a lot of these smaller vertical narratives. So just know that you're moving at a really fast clip. So you need to figure out your prep process and your workflow quite well. I use a lot of my digital tools. I don't use a physical folder anymore, but that was kind of back then I was using that, but each to their own. Here are some of the tools that I use. Notability is a new tool. I have a screenshot of that I started using. I use my iPad. That's all I take on set. It's my iPad in my bag. And all my shot list, everything is on that. And I, tend to just move really fast on set when I do that. Lookbooks, I make my lookbook vertical. So I convert it all over so that you're already in the world as soon as you're, even in that prep stage and you're sharing to your HODs. I kind of make sure that my lookbooks reflect the project. If you don't already know, these are all the information that you need to be sending to your HODs. Like I said, I'm not going to go super in depth because it's just general prep, but just so, specifically vertical and breaking the script down, there's not a lot of difference. Obviously, like I said, there's a lot bigger page count for usually vertical shows because you're moving at such a clip and people are talking so fast. So there's a little bit more breakdown that needs to happen script-wise. I make sure that I'm very tight with my color coding. You can use Scriptation to do this all again. Like I said, I'm not paid by Scriptation, but I love that. I love their app. They're really, they're so good and they're really supportive of filmmakers. But you can also export all these notes out to all your HODs, which is really helpful. And like my last vertical was 110 pages. So we shot in 9 days. So having Scriptation to bring all those changes, drafts, Scriptation will basically import all your notes from every draft into the next draft. And having that has been a real lifesaver because you can imagine 110 pages of you're on like goldenrod. That's a lot of notes to move over. The Dead Girls was, I think, 157 pages, but we had 28 days to do that. So it's still a little nutty because it was 20 episodes cross-blocking. But, it's really good to have a tool like this that you can just keep track of all those notes, all those changes. This is the way I shot listed Dead Girls with my DP. Obviously, very detailed because we had a lot of VFX and then we had a lot of, camera A, camera B. We had a lot of characters. So we had a really tight shot list for this. And we had to keep note of all our split screens, transitions. Not every project is shot listed this way, but we had a lot of like little notes that we had to keep in mind when we were doing Snapchat. All the characters had to face camera if they were speaking. So there were notes like that. There were notes like they didn't want any over the shoulders. So, it kind of restricts your shot listing a little bit. With the current vertical romance verticals, they don't really have that. restrictions so much. So that's really more up to you, not more up to the styling. But imagine this kind of tiny frame. There's a reason why over the shoulders are the best for those, because you are taking up a lot of the frame that way. So just keeping all of that in mind when you're shot listing. And like, these are short scenes or short episodes, but the shot list is still really big, like I said, because of the fast rate of change. This is kind of another way that I shot list. This tends to be more longer form narratives that I do, but I also still kind of do this shot listing generally. Transitions are really important because you're kind of, you're in this vertical world. So it's similar to, I guess, normal filmmaking, but when you're moving so fast, you kind of have to really keep an eye on your transitions because, from scene to scene, it can get a little disorientating. Quick note on shot listing. Probably shouldn't say this, but when I did my last show, I shortlisted the whole show, all my pages, 9 days. And then the first day, I kind of just had to throw it out because it's a little bit chaotic. Having it was a really good roadmap. And, the script supervisor had it. So people had an idea of what we wanted to go for. And obviously the DP had an idea, but you have to be really light on your feet and be able to pivot because a lot of these are lower budget, so you sometimes don't really get a full scout. So your shot list is great, but you might get into these locations and realize you can't use half of it. So you have to be able to move and be nimble and have that as your guideline. But you can also come in, on the day and just have to think on your feet and spin it around completely. And, like I said, coverage is king. So you really have to make sure you can be really efficient with your shot list because you can't have like a massive, long, crazy shot list, but you also can't have too few shots. So you have to find the sweet spot between that to be able to tell your story. So this is the way I shot listed and did my overheads for my last show. It also helps, when you're working on a time crunch. This is a lot more complicated camera movements than you would usually get on a vertical, but I just wanted to show this because this is something fun and new that I figured out using an app called on the iPad called Notability, which you could import your overheads on and draw all over it. But you could also do these shot lists on the same page. And it's a really great app because it's a really good at organizing and drawing and doing the shot list. And a lot of the times when you're doing these really fast paced, this was a 44-day shoot. So it was quite a lot bigger and it wasn't vertical, but it was a tool that I found that made my life so much easier because I could do this in the car on the way to set and just scribble on the overhead and just write a shot list really fast, all in one app. And I didn't have to, flip between apps back and forth.
And it says, if you're moving so much and trying to get through everything quickly, are you on a rig Steadicam more than you would be on a traditional film?
Not really. Actually, you would think that you would be on a Steadicam, but the DPs I've worked with tend to shy away from those on these because they're a little harder to control, especially your horizontal. So you don't really have time to use it all day. So what we did were actually my DP on this last vertical used sliders. And I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, but he was so good and so fast. The two operators would be sometimes on the same slider or two sliders, and you could get movement. You're just not doing, long follows and whatnot, but you could control your framing a lot easier, if that answers the question. But the main reason was because of control, because, you don't want to reset, even if you have the best Steadicam operator in the world, you're not going to get it in one, which also sometimes you kind of have to on these. But yeah, to get any kind of movement, we would either go sliders or, a little bit of the sticks panning and tilting, but generally stayed away from Steadicams. Or sometimes we did use the rigs, but again, it's that control in finding your frames, sometimes, especially on tighter shots. It's a little harder with those. Storyboarding, sorry for the terrible sketches, but I do them myself because, I only really storyboard for action or stunt scenes, but it's also really good helping you figure out how to frame it in a vertical world this way. I always do them for these either complicated camera moves or anything to do with stunts or actions. And also just makes it obviously a lot clearer, but you can do it vertically as well. A lot of these smaller, fast moving shoots, you kind of have to think out of the box very often. Like, how are you going to do interesting camera moves with very little time? And also choosing when you're going to do that. So you can't do that for every scene. You're never going to get through your day. So choose a couple of like hero move scenes where you're going to do something fun, where you're going to do something interesting that's going to be either on your reel or, like that's going to really make the show pop. But if you do that, you really make sure that you discuss with your DP and your AD about timing, about, technically how you're going to get through this. For example, this one, I knew that I wanted this shot here of my lead on the right waking up. He wakes up on the floor and I wanted this kind of spin when he sits up, but we didn't have a gimbal because, lower budget. So we had to figure out how to do it. And we didn't have time to test it in prep. So I made a deal with my DP and my AD where he gave us half an hour, and during, setups between two scenes, he gave us half an hour to figure it out. And if we didn't get it done and the rig set up in time and all that, we would move on. So we eventually had, I think, 2 takes with this rig that the lovely grips and everybody made. It was awesome. It didn't work. The spin shot didn't happen. We had to completely dismantle. And I said, okay, we have 10 minutes left. Operator's going to sit on the ground and spin it himself. And we got 2 more takes of that. And we still did it in the half hour and we moved on from that. And the rest was, basic coverage. So try to choose scenes where you really want to try something and have fun and be your hero scenes. Just don't do it for the whole show unless you have time. If you have the luxury of time, you can go for it, obviously. But like I said, these tend to be smaller, lower budget, fast paced. So standard coverage with a lot of coverage, and then choose a couple of hero scenes that you really want to show off. Specifically with some of these romance ones, because they're on an app, they have a paywall, and it's usually the first 10 episodes of the first 5 episodes that they call their hero episodes. And you really have to make sure you nail those scenes. And then the rest of them, they tend to not really mind what you do as long as the coverage works and they can get, the scenes cut. So you really concentrate on those, what they call the hero scenes, and make sure they look great. You do some of your fancy moves there. And then after that, you can choose which of the scenes that you really want to show off something fun with, whether it be with the actors or technically. So next thing, this is just some of the stuff that I do generally, but also, specifically for the vertical when I shoot these fast-paced shows. And you can't really do this on a union show, sort of. I don't know. You can get people's permission to do this because you're not supposed to work at meal times. But I asked my HODs, my AD, my DP, script supervisor, sometimes wants to be there, sometimes not, to just have a really quick 10-minute discussion at breakfast. And we just go through the floor plan. We talk about our time setups and we talk about any upcoming issues. So you get those out of the way every morning and you kind of start the day on a really good footing and everybody knows what is up. I always get to set an hour early. You catch problems that way. You also can just tour the set and make sure you're in the right frame of mind and you know what you're doing. And you can, especially on these when you're not necessarily sticking to a traditional shot list or anything like that, or you need to pivot, you just get there and walk the sets and figure it out. A lot of the times on these vertical romance, I'd walk them with my DP as we are loading in, and we just very quickly figure out which direction we're shooting, what we're shooting first, and making sure that we have enough coverage. And if we're changing anything up, we figure all of that out on that first walkthrough. And the AD is always there with us. You don't get rehearsal time a lot of the times, especially for these, these shows. So I tend to do it, between setups, after meals. To be fair, there's not a lot of rehearsing anyway, but I've already talked to the actors beforehand. I've already called them. We've already had chats. We've already had, little mini rehearsals, but you don't really have a lot of time with actors before or during. So it's tend to just try and steal moments here and there. But when you're shooting 15 pages a day, and sometimes I've lost count of how many scenes, you don't really have a lot of time with them. So you just try to steal moments here and there as you're whizzing through setups. And I think that's kind of it in terms of slides. But like I said, I do teach prep. These are just some of the little things that I do in terms of prepping for any kind of show. But I just wanted to show you these little bits here and there.
Can you go back to some of your quick ones where you were showing the frames from the film? Just because I think that those are so interesting.
This one?
Yeah, these are just great. For people who got on late, I feel vertical is we don't even think about it. When we're watching something like this, we don't think about how much prep and planning goes into getting these shots to tell the story that we would normally tell
Right.
1080 frame.
Yeah, because it's funny. Like, I think the most common question I get is, do you shoot on an iPhone? It's like, no, not yet. I've not done that yet. But, we shoot, I think this one was on a Sony, the one on the right, and the one on the left was Alexa Minis, two Alexa Minis.
Can you talk a little about eye lines when you have your split shots that are stacked?
Split screen, you mean?
Yeah.
Same kind of thing. It depends on, like you just work with your scripty and you figure out your eye lines. It's same as the same that you would usually shoot. If it's like, you kind of just have to think of it as like two shots in consecutive order. So you just split it that way. Like he's looking, to the right and they're looking to the left. But it's like same, like I said, it's similar stuff. You just have to adapt it to the verticals. Sorry, did that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Liam wants to know, what is your average crew size for these?
These are two very different shows. So when I did Snapchat, we had a crew of 65 because that was a big show. That was, with Universal and et cetera, et cetera. So that was a much, much bigger budget than any of these smaller romance ones. The smaller romance ones are very small. I think the last one was around 20, I believe, or less. They're very small.
What is your involvement in post? What's the timeline look like? Do you treat these like normal films?
Again, two different experiences. And the Snapchat, I was very heavily involved in the post for it. We were in post for 2 months for the 20 episodes. We got together the first season, which was 10 episodes out within, I think, in 25 days. So I was there every day in the editing, in the post house, all the way down to color, ADR, very, very heavily involved from the get-go on that one. For this other one, these like the apps, I wasn't involved at all in post. I just finished shooting and handed over, and that was it. So I don't think it's always like that in terms of these newer romance dramas, but I wasn't involved at all. And I think that's not super unusual.
Leon would like you to talk more about that, about your relationship with these studio app platforms and how you work with them. I think one thing that people like to know is like, how do you get hired? And then, what's your process like? Is it sort of like working with a studio?
I got hired by the producer. I think that's generally how it's done. It's a lot of word of mouth because a lot of the platforms are Chinese platforms that are coming in and producing here. So a lot of the producers are Chinese or Chinese Americans, and they send out within their network usually. For obvious reasons, because a lot of the clients are not native English speakers, so they need a little bit of translation in between. But yeah, I got hired by a producer, and the next one, same thing. I met him at a networking thing for verticals, and that's how I met the producer for the next one.
Do you often have improvisation / rewrites on set?
Rewrites, yes. It happened on both shows, and it happened on my show in Indonesia as well for a couple of different reasons. Again, these are very fast moving and tend to, like, the dialogue tends to not quite work in the traditional sense of writing it. So actors do get the freedom to rewrite or reword if something's just not working. So that tends to happen quite frequently. But on Dead Girls, we had the writers on set. So that was a little tighter in terms of rewrites and improvising. But on these verticals, you don't really. So you can kind of, as a director, have a little bit more like freedom to do that, especially as a lot of the clients are not native English speakers. So you kind of have to adjust and make the words work for the scene and for English. So yeah, quite often. And as a director, you're kind of working with them quite a lot with the actors to make it work.
Is getting hired for vertical any different from getting hired on other types of shows? Especially I'm thinking your first one, you didn't actually have the vertical experience necessarily. So how did you sell yourself, if you remember?
For the Snapchat one, it was a very complicated process. Because it was a vertical, because I hadn't done one before and I had to prove that I had ideas on vertical framing, like my lookbook there. That's kind of the first step of how I sold myself, because they were kind of excited that I submitted a vertical lookbook, which seems intuitive, but maybe not to some. So I had to prove that I could figure out the framing and of it all. But it was a really long, involved process. I think there were 3 interviews, and then I had to do an interview at Snapchat HQ with like 8 EPs. It was a very weird feeling, like a panel, basically. So it was really hard to get that one. But once I did that, the process for the verticals now is not as complicated, but they do want people with vertical experience for these reasons, because it's moving at such a fast pace. The learning curve is really like steep. So there's not a lot of time to figure out how to frame properly, how to, move. The main thing is, how do you keep the crew moving and how do you keep production moving when you're doing 15-page days or sometimes bigger on a very, very, very limited budget. So you have to have a really good imagination, and a lot of those romance ones is about making something shot on a shoestring budget look like, a luxurious Netflix unlimited budget show, which is a challenge in itself.
Well, I will say, y'all, if you have a chance, I would look Soma's work up. Everything she does is gorgeous. Like, she is everything she's ever done. It's just fantastic. And she also does like she was saying, she does a prep class. If you haven't taken it, you need to take this class. Maybe you could send an email to everybody when you do it again, because she takes what she's done here and goes into even more detail and will just up your game. Do you think creating an independent vertical narrative story to be licensed to the vertical apps is a viable production company business model? Based on your experience, do you have any thoughts?
Don't know. It's kind of more of a business question, but I don't know. People have been talking about it. Sure, why not? But like I said, there's a very specific way of storytelling that these apps want. So you might want to make sure that you talk to them first and see whether that's possible. And also just remember, your profit margins are probably going to be very slim if you do that.
Yeah, I would say that's the one thing, Xavier, especially as you're saying, you're thinking about this with your production company. This kind of stuff isn't a big budget. You're not going to be making a big payday. So you're going to put a lot of work in, and most of your money's going to go to crew. So you got to think, it's same like music videos. Like, they're just not where the money is. Now, if you could take your production company and get into this for commercial, maybe that might be the way to go. Commercials throw money around like, they're, I don't know, rappers in a video or something. But
yeah, it's not to say that it's not, I think there's a lot of people thinking about this. There's a lot of people talking about it. It's just that this specific genre has very specific storytelling, and it's very, like shock soapy. So if you want to make that, just consider those. Watch a few of them.
And I think too, Soma, when yours are done, maybe we can send everybody the links just so they can see I know you Dead Girls is out.
Yeah, Dead Girls you can watch on YouTube, I think. I don't know. It's still on Snapchat. I'm not sure.
Oh, Snapchat is still around, isn't it?
So.
Like, if it's not TikTok, I don't know where to find it.
So a lot of our background of a lot of my team and myself is we worked on like asylum films. So features shot in 6 days, lifetime shot in
So you get it.
in 15 days. Yeah. So definitely with the quick turnarounds is something we're all very familiar with. And the other half of our team is from reality TV background. So again, quick turnarounds and knowing how to shoot, frame up and everything like that. So right now, like besides the commercial work we do, in order to get more into like narrative work, we've been producing a lot of short films or director, writers, or anything like that don't really have the know-how of production as well. And it's kind of brought up the whole vertical thing a little bit more. Some of our DPs are very interested in shooting vertical films, but finding the people that are even paying to help with the cost of production to shoot a vertical has been kind of hit or miss. Like I went to a small business expo in Pasadena. It happened to happen upon one person. I was like, oh yeah, I shoot vertical films, and lost his business card, which is the worst thing that happened to me that day. I was like, are you kidding me? There's companies like, I think it's Bigaloo or something like that. I've noticed on Instagram, they're like,
yeah, I've seen their ads.
Looking for creators. So like submitted to them, but kind of just trying to figure out who's the person, who are the people doing these things. Because when you look up like vertical production companies or anything like that, you just get vertical entertainment, which is
the
real production.
Right.
Honestly, I don't know if you would find them, but I think like the apps themselves, there's like, Real Shorts is the most famous one, Dreamy, Drama Box. But there's a lot of smaller independent, mostly they're small independent production companies or producers who are just pulling teams together. They're not even production companies. And it's almost like until you know and you get in on the network, you don't know. It's like a strange thing. Like once you're in, you suddenly meet everybody that's doing them. But I feel like you can throw a rock in LA these days and find someone who's working on these DP/crew/anybody. And like once you just need to get to that person and ask them, hey, to the next person, to the producer, to the this. And that's how I did it, honestly. It was through a producer I knew who got me the first one. And then I went to literally a vertical mixer on the beach. And that's how I got my next job.
Wow, that's the thing.
Yes.
Xavier, I'd like to put out a challenge for you. So if you really decide you want to do this, which is decide to host a panel, maybe in person, maybe online. I don't know where I'm assuming you're located in LA with all you're doing, but maybe that's a bad assumption.
I am in LA, yeah.
Okay, figure. But like, let's do something for Blackmagic Collective, and then that gives you an excuse to like go and get these people that you want to be hiring you on a panel. You moderate it, you get to know them, and then we can all learn more from you doing that. So I'm going to just say that's an option, and we'd love to host that. And if you want to put that together, because I feel like just the fact that so many of you showed up to this class, which sadly I should have promoted this more, like Soma's going to teach you prep, because I think we learned stuff on this that translates beyond vertical, even though it was specific to vertical. But like just the fact that somebody showed up shows there's an interest in this. And it would be nice to see what's out there. It'd be nice to see who, like we know that this is not even the future. This is the now. So what other, who's buying things? Like I'm about to do a TV show that I keep thinking, should we do it vertically since it's about influencers? Like, I'd love to have those conversations answered as well.
So I've heard a couple of rumors. I think this is not a rumor. TikTok are creating their own originals, vertical narrative originals now. So they are, from what I heard, reaching out to production companies to create their own rather than I think they do a lot of advertising for these romance dramas on their platform, but now they want to get in. And I don't know if this is real, but at a conversation, at a mixer, I heard that even some of the bigger platforms are looking like Hulu, and that I don't know what is.
Well, and I think that Xavier's smart to think let me be, because I always tell this to all my directors, my filmmakers, whatever, pigeonhole yourself. Don't think, oh, if I get known as the vertical guy, I can't do other things. I'm just saying get known as that one thing, be the go-to people. And especially if it's hard to find people that are doing that right now, put yourself out on Google as the vertical production company. And maybe you guys can just shoot some stuff in the meantime to have little sizzles that are that look fancy without having full things. But I think you're on the right track, thinking ahead of the game.
Awesome. Thank you. And I would love to help put together a panel.
Just email info@blackmagiccollective.com and we can chat more and figure it out when you think you want to do it, all that stuff.
So I'm interested in breaking into writing for verticals, more the Snap original side than the real short side. And
sure. Okay.
Curious if you have any advice for writers or things that you would want to see in those scripts.
I think the obvious answer for a lot of these is that you're basically writing kind of multiple cliffhangers, because the Snapchat ones are 5 minute, between 5 to 10 minutes. I think our episodes are between 5 to 8 minutes. So you have to really think of your story structure as just every almost 10 pages, there's something huge happening and it's da, da, da. So writing them is a little different because it's kind of exhausting because you're just churning out pages. But I feel vertical storytelling, it's a lot more heightened, right? It's not these slow burn. There's just a lot of drama every minute. Basically.
Soma, is there a way, I know probably not for the most recent one, but for maybe Dead Girl, since it's been out for a while, is there a script maybe you can send Meredith just so she can see how it looked on page? I know I don't even have it, but
yeah, I don't know if I still have pages, but I'll see if I can find some. I'm not sure. Let me see. It's been a while, but yeah, it's just, it's writing. It's a little bit like writing comedy where you're just, think of it as you need almost twice as many pages as you would normally. But story structure, like I said, it's just that that constant cliffhanger every 5 minutes. Imagine you just cliffhanger. So, and how to make that flow into where it's not too exhausting, but it's into a story, I think is the biggest challenge in terms of writing these. And a lot of the dialogue has to be really short and snappy because you're not going to be monologuing in these verticals. I think that's one thing. And I'm always curious to see whether a horror would work on a vertical because I feel
horror would work really well.
I've heard that it doesn't, and I don't know if that's true, but I would love to know if that could work.
I feel like you and Xavier should get together and make a horror.
Sure.
Find that money, Xavier.
We are literally working on a horror right now.
Yeah. I heard from a vertical producer, that they did try a couple of them and they all failed. And I don't know for what particular reason, but I just feel like that vertical framing would work so well for horror because you don't know what's happening to the left and right of you, and you can really do some interesting storytelling. But
maybe you didn't work because they didn't hire you.
Maybe. But thank you, Meredith. Yeah, let me see if I can find those and share them if I can find them.
Thank you so
Anybody
much.
else want to get in a last minute question here? I love we've got more people on camera. Hi.
Hi. I just want to know how you take your prep class.
Oh, it's actually on my website. I don't do them the most often, but I'm just going to put the link in the chat. But you can have a look at it on my website here. I'll probably start one because I'm starting prep on my next vertical now this week. So maybe once I finish that, probably at the end of October or the beginning of November, I'll do another one.
So basically, go to your site, sign up for the newsletter so they get notified. Soma doesn't send out like, hey, here's what's going on with me. She'll just let you know when.
I'm sorry. I'm very because I never really know what's going on in terms of prep or anything.
So you'll sign up and get
Also,
information on that.
My Instagram is usually where I will share if I am doing a prep class. And I do too. I do short form prep and I do like a more complicated episodic advanced prep, which is a lot more of like crossboarding and block shooting and, these crazy, because I just did an 8-episode hour-long TV show in Indonesia. We shot that in 44 days. So, yeah.
Wow.
With stories that we could have a whole hour on. Non-recorded hour on. Marlon, good to see your face. I feel like you're prone for that vertical horror. Like that should be your next thing to try out.
What you really caught my interest when you said there was a successful horror one. So I'm writing notes as we speak, and this.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it is just. I imagine I haven't seen it and I don't know what went wrong with those ones, but it's probably not adapting to this format. Because, horror, there's that slow build, that, suspense stuff that maybe you're trying to keep people's attention on a phone, basically, for most of these. And let's be honest, attention spans are very short. So how do you do a horror where you don't have these long stretches, or maybe you minimize those, or how do you create scares and tension where you don't have the luxury of time, I feel like is a good way of, and how do you storytell successfully in a new format that way, But I would love to do one. I've thought about it since I did Snapchat. Honestly, I was like, this would be wild because it's so visceral and it's in your face when you're watching a vertical in your hands. You can do some really cool, scary stuff with that. But I think it takes thinking a little outside of the box in terms of how to tell that story.
Soma, this was so freaking good. All right. I will see you guys all on the next thing. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.